I'm Bill Galston, a senior fellow in governance studies, and this is an all governance studies panel, which will give you sort of a leading indicator of where the center of gravity of our discussion is going to be. I'm not going to spend a long time introducing my colleagues from governance studies. Their lengthy bios are available to you in your packets. Suffice it to say that Pietro Nivola is a senior fellow in governance studies. He holds a chair and he's a former vice president directing governance studies. To my left, stage right, Elizabeth Jacobs, a fellow in governance studies, whose work very intriguingly crosses boundaries of politics, economics, and sociology, and addresses a range of issues, including economic security and mobility questions. Let me just tee up this conversation by asking a question: how should we listen to a State of the Union address? Who is speaking to us? To whom is the speaker speaking? And what is the speaker talking about and not talking about? And this points to one of the interesting and distinctive features of the American constitutional system in the first place, namely that the president wears multiple hats in a way that really isn't paralleled anywhere else in the advanced democracies, because the president is the head of state, equivalent to a king or a queen or a president in parliamentary systems that also have a prime minister. He is the chief executive officer of the government. He is the leader of his party, and in years divisible by 4, he is also a candidate for election if he's ending his first term. And I would submit to you that all 4 of those presidential characters were on display last night in very interesting and intertwined way. Second question to ask yourself as you're listening to a State of the Union address: what should you be listening for? And a State of the Union address proceeds on a number of different planes simultaneously: on the plane of ideology, on the thematic plane, on the plane of policy, and we heard a full discussion of that in the previous hour, on the plane of governance, and of course, politics. And as the president is putting his chips down on certain squares, he is refraining from putting them down in other squares. And a speech, especially a State of the Union, is significant for what it does not say as well as what it does say. And finally, there is the question of the audience. To whom is the president speaking? And from year to year and speech to speech, that question admits of a different answer. There have been years when the President of the United States was speaking as much to foreign audiences as to the people of the United States. This, I would suggest, was not one of those years. And that is a distinction that makes an important difference. And within the American electorate, to whom is the president speaking? That, too, changes from year to year, and it reflects a broad political judgment and a broad political strategy. So that's a general framework for listening not only to the President's State of the Union, but to the astute commentary that is about to follow. And here's the way we'll proceed. I will ask first Pietro Nivola, then Elizabeth Jacobs to deliver introductory remarks. They have prevailed upon me to step out of my moderator's role for a few minutes and offer a few of my own thoughts. If If anything particularly interesting has come up that distinguishes our various analyses and positions, distinguishes them not by excellence but from one another, then we'll have a little bit of crosstalk. And then in the remaining 10 minutes or so, perhaps 15, depending on how things go, we'll go to questions from the audience. We started a little bit late, and therefore I have received permission to end a little bit late, sometime between 25 and 20 of 1. And with that, Pietro Nivola.
Thanks, Bill. Glad to be up here. Let me begin by just saying this is another case of both good news and some bad news in last night's speech. I think that on the whole, this was a much better speech than was given last year. It was delivered with verve and passion. And if you'll recall, last year's speech, the basic motif was winning back the future, winning the future. So that was kind of more of an attempt to change the subject from what was from bad times to much better, to sort of better times in the future. And so the speech was full of sort of futuristic investment plans and the like. Though I'd say the one missing component last year, and it was pretty conspicuous in terms of forward-thinking plans, was no endorsement of the Bowles-Simpson Commission on deficit reduction. But the main trouble, I think, with winning the future last year was that it wasn't the kind of thing that would gain a lot of traction while people were principally preoccupied with the here and now of joblessness and the economic slump. The recession was very much on the minds, front and central on the minds of most people. So it was hard to sort of captivate them with visions of the future or the long term. Last night's message was different. It was much more persuasive, I thought. There were no sort of utopian schemes in there, or at least there were fewer of them. There was no mention, for example, of how we might be able to get to 80% of our electric power through purely clean energy sources and that sort of thing. But above all, there was a new theme, and that new theme, of course, was concern for basic economic fairness in American society. And I think that theme touches a chord. Most Americans, I think, are troubled with the glaring inequities and excesses of recent decades, and especially during the years leading up to the recession. And by the way, I think this this concern is at both ends of the political spectrum. It's not just the left wing. You can see it in traces of what the Tea Party complains about too. So yes, I think channeling some strains of Teddy Roosevelt's populist zeal made great sense, and it will resonate. It will resonate in the course of the campaign. That's the good news, especially in a strictly political sense of last night's message. Here's the less than great news, or the more debatable part of what he talked about last night. And I want to say three things. First of all, in American society, there are real cultural constraints on how far you can push something like the fairness issue. The national electorate is looking for not just for a president of the middle class, but a president of all the American people. And in fact, back to your question at the outset, Bill, I mean, the audience last night was the center of the American electorate as a whole. As you know, Americans are traditionally receptive to appeals for equality of opportunity. They're much more skeptical about making a case for equality of results or status. There was a poll, like I think it was a Gallup poll back in December, that found that well under 50% of respondents were not eager to see the government step in to close the gap between rich and poor, for example, even though 70% favor measures that address equality of opportunity. Now, the president, I think, understood this very well and handled it very skillfully last night. The central message, I think this is the main part of his speech that really was pay dirt. Quote, "We can either settle for a country where a shrinking number of people do really well while a growing number of Americans barely get by, or we can restore an economy where everyone gets a fair shot, everyone does their fair share, and everyone plays by the same set of rules. What's at stake are not democratic values or Republican values, but American values." That was exactly the right note to strike. But notice, there's a world of difference between invoking a fair shot and calling for a fair share. You're going to find in the course of the campaign that this difference is going to be very carefully parsed. It will be very closely scrutinized. The Republicans are going to raise questions about this type of thing. They're going to contest the notion that the wealthy are not paying necessarily their fair share if you don't raise the marginal tax rate up to 30%. So look for that in the course of the campaign. It's obviously going to be something that Obama will have to address. And Republicans will especially make this case when approximately half of all households don't pay any income tax at all, federal income tax. So that leads me to my second observation, which you may find a little naive. I was a bit disappointed that the whole notion of comprehensive tax reform got short shrift last night. It would have been nice to see a more full-throated endorsement of full-on tax reform in this society. We have an extremely Byzantine tax system, and I think it's at the root not only of a lot of inequities, but a lot of inefficiency. So when we can talk later about what I mean by tax reform, but it goes well beyond just making sure that a few more millionaires pay a higher marginal tax rate. What we need in this country is to shift the whole tax burden away a little bit from not just taxing earnings, savings, and investment, but also toward taxing consumption. And so one last comment, and then I'll shut up. I also thought there was too little discussion of what is, I think, the central domestic policy predicament of our times, and that is how to secure the safety net of the modern welfare state, how to render its huge entitlement programs sustainable. So those are my 2 cents, Bill.
Thank you, Pietro. More than 2 cents, at least 3 cents. Elizabeth?
All right, I think I have 2.5 cents. So I'll start with the observation that I went back before the State of the Union and read States of the Union for presidents in similar positions as the president's in right now, so election year State of the Unions. And the most obvious comparison is between Reagan in 1984, who was facing a pretty rough economy and looking for re-election. And actually, during this first panel, I went back and reread that speech yet again because it occurred to me that there were some lines that sounded kind of familiar based on last night's speech. America is back, for example. That literally is right there in Reagan's speech in the very beginning. And similarly, this formulation, the State of the Union is getting stronger. That was Obama's formulation. President Reagan, America is much improved, and there's good reason to believe that that improvement will continue. So clearly I wasn't the only one who went back and read past States of the Union. And I think, it was a smart thing to do. The president's got smart people around him, far smarter than I. And I think it was wise. Reagan was obviously very successful. I would point out that it was probably not because of his State of the Union that he got reelected, but it was a masterful way of kind of navigating tough economic times and simultaneously addressing the fact that times were tough, but looking forward in a way that felt grounded in reality. And it's pretty clear that President Obama attempted to do the same and I think was pretty successful. So some of the points I have to make actually echo what Pietro said, and so I'll try and keep it brief. The first one is this idea of economic fairness. Clearly was sort of one of the big takeaways from Obama's speech last night. And I think it was a good one. I think that obviously he's been kind of dancing with this idea of inequality and the problem of inequality in our society, which is a tricky one for exactly the reasons that Pietro's highlighted. Americans like equality of opportunity a lot. Americans do not like equality of results. And so trying to figure out how to talk about the problem of inequality without kind of frightening Americans into worrying that he's a socialist who's looking to impose a ceiling on how well you can do in America it's tricky politics, particularly obviously during an election season. And I think the fairness theme actually allows him to kind of make a case that's sort of less frightening in a way, in part because it lets him talk about inequality in the context of opportunity. And as Pietro was talking, I was thinking about Alan Kruger's speech at the Center for American Progress, which was really linking these ideas of inequality and opportunity with the idea that Kruger put out, and I think that was implicit in how Obama was talking about fairness, that too much inequality can make opportunity impossible, and that's really sort of the link that he's trying to make. This isn't about equality of results. This is making sure that we can continue to be an upwardly mobile society, that we can continue to have the real opportunity that we think of as American, but that at a certain point, the level of inequality, the shape of the income distribution can get in the way of that being possible. And I think that's really what he's trying to flesh out, and I think it's pretty smart. It allows him to get around this charge of the politics of envy, because he can say this isn't about envy. We want everyone to succeed. We're just at a point right now where because of the way things work, everyone can't succeed. And so we need to kind of rejigger things to make sure that our ultimate goals are still possible. And I'd say also that I was looking at some focus group results last night from swing voters' responses to this formulation of fairness, and it tests quite well. I mean, I think we're up here from governance studies to talk about the politics of the speech, and from that perspective, there's a risk to talking about fairness, all of the ones that Pietro and I've just talked about, but Democrats, somewhat unsurprisingly, like that fairness message a lot, particularly the Buffett rule. This 30% of your income is taxed if you make over $1 million. That's just going to be kind of be a basic way of how we do things. Now, what that means exactly is up in the air, but as a basic principle of kind of fleshing out what this means. So Democrats exceeded 80% on the 0 to 100 scale. They really like that idea. More surprisingly, Republicans exceed 70. So they like that idea too. 70 is a pretty good number on a scale of 0 to 100. And perhaps even more importantly, independents are at above 70 as well. So that suggests that this fairness frame is actually a good one for Obama. Obviously, things change, but going forward, I think he's potentially kind of figured out how to talk about the issues of inequality and mobility in a way that tests well. And from a political perspective, that's obviously what he's aiming to do, is keep his job. So that's general point 1.5, I guess. I have a couple kind of musings on the policy specifics, and obviously the first panel was really here to talk specifics about policy, but I tend to think about policy both as policy but also the politics of the policy, so I thought I would bring that into this panel as well. The first is this a point just about the way the president talks about manufacturing. I think based on my Twitter feed responses and the conversation this morning so far, I think that the manufacturing that the president is talking about is very different from how I think many Americans think of manufacturing. The president isn't talking about widgets and assembly lines. That's not... I mean, I'm not inside his head, but I'm fairly certain, based on knowing kind of how people are talking about job creation and manufacturing in the policy world, he's talking about advanced manufacturing, which is really about robotics. It's about high-tech computing. It's a very high-skill, high-tech future. And I think whether it's a problem or not that he didn't make that clear. I think it's worth putting out there in terms of thinking about what his vision is all about. It's not a sort of looking backwards towards our assembly line age. It really still is in keeping in some ways with the Clinton knowledge economy, but with sort of some more substance to it. I'd also say that the wonkosphere, including the first panel, have given Obama some flack for industrial policy. I don't have a firm position on this, but I would point out that in a sense we do have an industrial policy right now. It's just incentivizing things that don't make much sense. And so we have some options in terms of what we do. And I think the way the president's framed it is essentially saying, well, why don't we change those incentives to make some sense? You could argue that the right thing to do is just to completely remove what we've got in place now and have a real free market driven policy. But I would argue that the status quo isn't nothing. We've got a status quo in place that's incentivizing things kind of backwards. So that's my second sort of policy point. A third related point on the manufacturing bit is just that I'm sure many of you in this room have read the New York Times Sunday piece about Apple and iPhones, and more broadly really about the global supply chain and the serious challenges that the U.S. faces in trying to ultimately kind of create this vision of advanced manufacturing as the bedrock for our economic future. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do. It's one of the best pieces of reporting I've read in a long time. But in some ways, I'm sure the president read it, and I'm sure he just decided that he was going to punt and ignore it. But having read that piece and then listening to the speech, there's a big gap between the president's rhetoric and what we face in terms of challenges. And I'm glad it's not my job to figure out what to do about that gap, but I wish the president had addressed that a little bit more directly, because he skated over a lot there. Two other economic politics points. The first, on job training, I was heartened to hear the president mention it. I was not happy to see it, as usual, kind of skated over. It surprised me over and over and over again over the course of the recession and the recovery how minimal a role and how quiet the conversation has been about job training, given we have a long history of very confused and not particularly effective job training in this country, and it seems like we have this kind of political moment to really think hard about what to do, and we keep on not doing it, punting. And so I was glad to see the president mentioning it, but I don't feel like it was a particularly serious mention. There are 5.6 million long-term unemployed Americans today, and Obama proposes retraining program that would, the way he pitches it is this ambitious 2 million workers retrained. That seems to me to be a serious gap. Obviously, the entirety of those 5.6 million long-term unemployed Americans don't need to be retrained, but at the same time, a 2 million person retraining program strikes me as sort of an unambitious goal, given the opportunity for really thinking hard about that. And lastly, on the same theme of labor market issues, Bill mentioned in his opening remarks that states of the union and other addresses are just as important for what they say as what they don't say. The president made no mention of unemployed Americans or jobless Americans. He made a very clear and admirable push for extending the payroll tax cut. He mentioned nothing about extending unemployment benefits, which will expire. And given the number of long-term unemployed, it seems reasonable, and the level of the unemployment rate at this point as well, it seems reasonable to think that our existing federal extension of unemployment benefits is something that should stick around. Most economists agree that it's good policy for a variety of reasons. Most economists agree that it's significantly better policy than the payroll tax cut from an economic perspective. From a political perspective, it's quite obvious why the president would push the payroll tax cut but not mention the unemployment benefits extension. I think it'll be interesting to watch what happens with that. I'm not particularly optimistic about the fortunes of the unemployment benefits extension, given the president's clear unwillingness to go out on a limb for it. And based on conversations I've had with folks on the Hill, I don't think it's something that's likely to happen. So I would point those two out. And then I'll finish with just a note on kind of going back to the broader thematic points. And that's, I think the president really understands, it was clear from the speech, that the erosion of trust in government is a huge threat to our country right now. I mean, he said as much pretty explicitly. And I think it's both good policy and good politics, the way that he's brought that to the forefront. It's good policy because Americans hate government right now. Americans don't trust Congress. They don't particularly trust the presidency. I mean, it's a mess. Everyone who's sitting in this room, I'm sure, knows this. So it's good politics to kind of do what you can to rise above the fray and to try and do something about it. And the policies that he's put out there, as far as I know, this idea of ending the filibuster on nominations, that I think, and Bill knows this this policy arena better than I do, so you should correct me, but I believe that it's the first time that that's really out there as a proposal for something to be done about it, and I think that's admirable. Arguably, there's more that should be done on the filibuster in the Senate, but to start with something like nominations that's clear, it's easily explainable to the American people in a way that Senate procedure is not always, strikes me as both good politics and good policy. And I'll finish kind of going back around to where I started with this idea of the focus groups that I talked about earlier, these swing voters, there's Colorado swing voters. They liked the fairness message a lot, but they were deeply skeptical of Obama's ability to translate that vision into action, which speaks directly to what I was just saying about the importance of trust for the future of our democracy. And a lot of real polarization showed up, not in terms of their response to Obama's message, but in response to who was to blame for the fact that Obama had a very slim likelihood of actually doing anything about all of these proposals that they liked a fair bit. The Democrats in the group, these are swing voters, but many of them had party allegiances. The Democrats blamed GOP obstructionism. The Republicans blame Obama. And to the best of my knowledge, it wasn't clear who the independents blame, and it seems to me that that's actually a big question going forward, given the importance of independence in deciding elections in America these days.
Will, thanks so much to both of you for a very challenging and interesting set of comments. Fortunately, as both of you were talking, I was busy crossing items off my list of what I had to talk about, which simplifies my task considerably. I laid out a template at the beginning of what to listen for in the State of the Union. I'm just going to comment on a few of those points, and you'll follow in the wake of both of my colleagues and offer a little bit of data in support of particular propositions. Let me begin with a textual point, since my academic training is actually in the close reading of texts. If you look at the basic ideological orientation of the president's speech, it's really quite remarkable and quite telling. The speech was, I think, a very eloquent invocation of the ideology of fairness, solidarity, collective action, and common purpose. Really the classic themes of the progressive era and of Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism, etc. He was virtually silent on the classic American values of freedom and liberty. And that tells you everything you need to know about the ideological contest that awaits us over the next 9 months. Because I don't know of a single Republican, elected official or wannabe, who can utter 3 sentences without mentioning the word liberty. That's not a criticism, that's just a fact, right? And liberty is as close to the heart of American public culture as any value possibly can be. And so I think that one of the issues before us is the extent to which the president can go down this more solidaristic and communitarian role without running afoul of the more libertarian instincts that are not confined to Republicans or independents in the American polity. So much for ideology. Now let's think for a minute about the governance issue. Elizabeth talked, and I think quite rightly, about mistrust of government. What is, I think, so remarkable about our times right now is that it's mistrust of everything. I have I have a Gallup survey here from just last month. Adults, national adults, are asked, are they satisfied with the size and influence of major corporations? And 30% say they're satisfied, 63% say they're dissatisfied. Well, that sounds like the perfect predicate for left-wing populism, rail against the corporations. Then, question 2, are you satisfied with the size and power of the federal government? Satisfied, 29%, dissatisfied, 69%, even worse than the big corporations. That sounds like a predicate for a populism of the right. And then when you look at independents, you have only a quarter of independents satisfied with either the influence of big corporations or the influence of big government. If there was ever an opening for libertarian populism, that opening is this week. A plague on both your houses. I'm against corporate oppression and government oppression. Just leave me alone. There's a lot of that out there. And it's a wild card in our nation's politics. It is, as political scientists would say, orthogonal to both political parties, and it is a challenge to both political parties. Now, I would pose the following question, and it is, I think, a challenge to the president, but it's also a challenge to political analysis. And that question is this: given the level of mistrust of government to which Elizabeth pointed, which the data support, the focus groups support, given also the fact that at the end of the day, the president's 2012 State of the Union address announced a very activist public agenda. As the debate goes on, when the activist agenda encounters the mistrust of government, is it like matter and antimatter meeting in a big collision, leaving nothing behind except a discharge of energy in all directions? What happens? How do the American people balance their desire for action to help resolve our economic problems against their mistrust of the president's chosen instrument for achieving that action and those results? That's not a rhetorical question. I really don't know the answer, but it is a big question facing the country. It seems to me. Third comment about the State of the Union address in the context of the agenda facing the country. There are two kinds of elections, it seems to me. In one kind of national election, there is agreement on what the problem is, but disagreement about the solutions. And in a different kind of election, there is a disagreement even on the identity of the problems. Now, for a long time, I have believed that this election is going to be closer to a Type 1 election than a Type 2 election. That is, everybody agrees the problem is the economy. The question is what to do about it. And at a very high level of generality, that is true. But after listening to Mitch Daniels' response to the president last night, I'm a little bit less sure that it's true when you go down a level. The president is talking about the jobs feature of the economy. Mitch Daniels, on behalf of the Republicans, and I think accurately representing them, is talking about the size, the scope, and the cost of government as the key feature of the economy. And the Republican argument, stripped to its essentials, is that it is the size and scope and cost of the economy that is dragging the economy down. And so the Republican agenda focuses a lot more on the fiscal issues, the tax reform issues, et cetera, about which the president was conspicuously, as Pietro pointed out, nearly silent, and as Karen Dinan pointed out in the previous panel, nearly silent. And so you have, if not dueling agendas, very different conceptions of what the economic problem actually is. And part of what's going on in this general election will be a fight for the control of the agenda. And if the Mitch Daniels style argument about what the core economic problem is prevails, then the Republican nominee, whoever he may turn out to be, and interestingly, only one of the two front runners complies with the Buffett rule at this point, and it's not Mitt Romney. Then we have one kind of election. But if the president's framing of the problem prevails, we're going to have a very different kind of election. The final point that I want to make has to do with the audiences. The president was trying to speak, and I agree with Pietro here, to the broad middle of the country. That is to say, he was trying to speak to his base in a way that would appeal to independents as well. The focus groups and dial groups to which Elizabeth referred do support the proposition that at first blush, he managed to cross that bridge reasonably successfully. The question of whether the bridge is quite as solid as the debate goes on as it was when the president's speech was first received strikes me as a more difficult question because that's where the independents' mistrust of the national government, which is twice as high as Democrats' mistrust of the national government and of government as an effective instrument of national power, is going to become so important. The other question is how key elites are going to hear the speech, and in particular, the business elites who are responsible for many of the decisions as to where business activities are going to be placed, for example. Elizabeth referred to the remarkable New York Times front page story on Apple manufacturing. That's the tip of the iceberg. There was a survey that I just read of 10,000 graduates of the Harvard Business School that goes into great detail on the fundamental reasons why it is that so many manufacturers are choosing to manufacture offshore. And with all due respect to the president's argument, the problems are so much more complex and so much more challenging than a modest change in the U.S. tax code that I don't even know where to begin. The problem is much deeper, and every sensible business leader, including business leaders who are very well disposed to the president, will tell him that to his face if he asks. In other words, the economic challenge facing us, if the idea is to focus on manufacturing and get manufacturing jobs back to the United States, is very much complicated, deeper, and I believe graver and more challenging than the president indicated. And by the way, that's one of the problems with the very important truth that Elizabeth pointed out. If you're talking about advanced manufacturing rather than widgets, you're talking about a form of manufacturing that generates many fewer jobs per dollar of value added, right? That's one of the basic drivers of what's going on. So very, very difficult economic problem, and the president, I think, was identifying it, but with very broad brush strokes. I now want to pose a question, first to Pietro, and then a different question to Elizabeth, and after that, we'll have some time left for questions from the floor. Pietro, you made, I think, a very important distinction, which I think the president on one level would accept, between a fair shot and a fair share. Absolutely right. And if you parse that as equality of opportunity versus equality of results, you're absolutely right. But suppose fair share is understood not as getting your fair share, but as doing your fair share. That, it seems to me, was the president's emphasis, particularly with regard to wealthy Americans and the tax burden. And as you know, since I've shared the data with you, there's a mountain of evidence suggesting that when it comes to doing your fair share of paying taxes, the president is on reasonably solid ground. So do you think that distinction between doing your fair share and getting your fair share makes sense? Does it do any political work?
Yes, you read the or remember the passage very, very closely, Bill, and you're right. I mean, the president was careful to say doing your fair share, not getting your fair share. And so indeed. But I guess from the right side of the spectrum, the question would be, okay, if you have half of households not paying any income tax at all, are they playing by the same rules as everybody else? So, you know, anyway, they're going to go back and forth over these questions, you know, every which way. I want to pick up on what I guess the comment you made just before this one, which I thought was really fascinating, about whether there's a breakdown of any consensus on what the nature of the problem is, and if I could say something about that. I'm not sure that I think that's what's really going on. I think, you know, both sides here are deeply disturbed by what's happened to entrepreneurship, innovation. There's, you know, the pursuit on both sides is for more growth, more prosperity, clearly. Mitch Daniels last night was basically saying, you know, we got to reach those ends, we have to get the government out of the way. The president was saying, no, got to get the government in the mix. And I think the president made a pretty powerful case by citing the example of the automobile industry, which was, you know, an amazing success that I mean, who in this room or anywhere else would have predicted that GM would in fact return to being the #1 automaker in the world? It was amazing. So he picked his case there very, very, very skillfully. Where they disagree is I think, again, on the means. For the GOP, the debt problem and the deficit are front and central. What they are calling for is more deleveraging as quickly as possible, actually, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector. The president and the Democrats are saying, wait, not so fast. If we deleverage too quickly, we're going to be doing what they're doing over in Europe, which could put us back in the soup. So what they're calling for is indeed a proactive role of government in a counter-cyclical sense, government intervention to prevent us from slipping back into another recession. I think the problem that both sides have is that neither side is really willing to address some of the basics that are required to get back to growth and prosperity. For the Republicans, as we all know, I mean, if you're really serious about closing the deficit, you have to entertain the possibility of some tax increases. I personally think they have to be broad-based and not just at the top of the income ladder. On the Democratic side, you know, there is an issue with entitlement spending. I mean, you can't put your head in the sand about this. One has to address that. So that's where the big chasm lies.
Thanks. That's really interesting parsing of the question. I have a question for you, Elizabeth. Sort of a painful personal question for me, for reasons, for me, not for you, for reasons I'll describe. But first, you tossed me such a wonderful softball that I have to take a swing at it. You know, and your very closing remarks, you know, you talked about the erosion of trust in government, and part of that being congressional gridlock, and the president's proposal last night to have an up or down vote on all nominations within 90 days. And you conjectured that the president was the first to come up with that idea or to propose it.
The first politician.
The first politician.
I know he didn't come up with the idea.
Well, but this gives me, Norman Mailer once wrote a book called Advertisements for Myself. I personally think that should have been the title of every single book he ever published, but that's just me. One of the hats that I wear is policy advisor to a nonpartisan civic organization called No Labels, which on December 13th came out with its Make Congress Work agenda, of which the 90-day up or down vote for nominations was one of the 12 items in the agenda, and so there was a big cheer in the congressional reform community last night when the president uttered those words. But it has been, there has been pressure building from it, not just from the top, but from civic groups throughout the country. Now, here's my painful personal question. I spent 2.5 years as Walter Mondale's issues director, as you may know, and so I remember President Reagan's 1984 State of the Union address quite vividly, and in a way, you're right. I know that the Obama campaign has gone, the Obama administration, pardon that slip, the permanent campaign. The Obama campaign in 2008 went to school on the Reagan campaign, and I have no doubt that they read Reagan's '84 address very, 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 very carefully. But there are some interesting verbal differences that point to the underlying substantive differences which make a political difference. Reagan's formulation, if I recall correctly, is that the State of the Union is, quote, much improved.
I can check the text
Yes.
for you, in fact.
I think that's what he said.
Yes, much improved.
Much improved. Obama contented himself with saying that the State of the Union is stronger. Mm-hmm. If he had said much stronger, I think he would have gotten, the Bronx cheer from the country. Now, why could Reagan say that the State of the Union was much improved? Well, you can look it up, but in the prior year, 1983, the economy had produced 4 million jobs. That's about 300,000 a month, more than 300,000 a month.
Which is what we need to be doing right now.
Which is what we need to be doing right now, but haven't gotten close to in any one month in this recovery. Unemployment, which peaked at 10.8% right around the 1982 election, had come down nearly 2 full percentage points by the time Reagan gave his speech in 1984. There was a real sense of dynamism, of forward motion in the country that people could feel. And not long after that speech, the Reagan campaign unveiled its famous Morning in America ad, which I will never forget as long as I live, because it captured the popular mood. It's not even close to dawn in America right now, right? And the people know it. And so, from a political standpoint, President Obama has a much tougher row to hoe, it seems to me. And so, I wondered if you reflect for a minute on the differences in Obama's economic/political situation as opposed to Reagan's, because I think it makes a difference.
It does. I mean, I think you essentially made the point I would make, which is that on one hand, they're the most comparable cases that we have, but they're actually not comparable cases. The recovery was much farther along in Reagan's case than it is in Obama's, and so the difficulty of both touching on the progress that the country has made and claiming some credit for that so that people sort of understand that it's been worth having this guy around, but simultaneously not being overly optimistic and therefore totally, missing the ability to connect with the fact that there are still many, many people who are struggling. I think Obama's got a much harder, steeper hill to climb than Reagan did, and that's part of why I give him a great deal of credit for this particular speech, because I mean Reagan in some ways had it pretty teed up to give a killer speech. Obama didn't, and I don't think he gave a killer speech exactly, but I do think it was pretty darn good given the circumstances, and it remains to be seen, given those circumstances, what kind of momentum he's able to build, and whether the frameworks that he introduced in this speech that seem like they actually resonated pretty well, if we want to, base all of our predictions on 80 swing voters in Colorado, I don't know, but based on those folks and my general sort of sense of how people are responding, it seems like he's off to a pretty good start given the hill he has to climb.
Fair enough. Okay, we're right on schedule. We have about 10 minutes for questions from the floor, and in the name of geographical fairness, I think I will start at the back, if there are any questions at the back, and then work forward. Yes. And there are roving microphones. When you ask a question, please identify yourselves. Please make it a question.
Hi, I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician, among other things. My question is, why doesn't the president, since he's now been able to talk about taxes in terms of fairness, also link taxes with the deficit? Mitt Romney is a good example of how increasing somebody's taxes will not reduce their ability to produce jobs. It's questionable whether Mitt Romney ever produced any jobs.
Okay, good question. I think that he should have linked the question of taxation to the deficit. The question is, I mean, he did up to a point, but it was mainly some discussion of tweaking the corporate taxes in various ways and providing tax incentives and so on to spur growth. And of course, growth is supposedly revenue enhancing. So that was one part, and the other part was by getting I guess millionaires to pay more, a larger share. The trouble with that, of course, is that we know that that's not going to produce the kind of revenue that's going to make a big dent in the deficit, right? It's not enough money. And when we talk about tax reform, it has to extend well beyond the rich. It has to involve everybody at some level. And there are ways to do this. Let me suggest here that it would be refreshing someday to hear from our political leaders some serious discussion of maybe totally swapping the corporate income tax and possibly even the payroll tax for a value-added tax or a carbon tax or some combination thereof. We are the only major industrial country that does not have a value-added tax at the national level. We have state sales taxes, of course, but we don't have a, and one has to, in order to attain much greater productivity and much greater efficiency in the system, you have to begin to shift from just taxing earnings and so forth to taxing some consumption.
Let me just add to that, and then we'll move on to the next question. I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
No, go ahead.
Yep.
I just don't want to move on until I have my 2 cents, but you should.
Then, no, I'm sorry. You first, and then I'll play quick.
I'll be quick. But the point is just the president did in last year's State of the Union. He directly tied the issue of tax fairness to the deficit. I mean, he has a specific line. I think I lost it, but it's. I printed out all of my States of the Union and have my folder with the specific idea that I could quote if I needed to, and I can't find the quote. But he did specifically talk about the fact that the Bush tax cuts have contributed to the deficit, and then one of the things we could do to pay down the deficit would be, rejiggering individual income taxes in order to make sure that the wealthy pay a fair share, et cetera. I think, and I certainly wasn't privy to the negotiations, but my sense is the very, very, very back seat that deficit talk took in this speech was an explicit choice, with the idea being that it sort of complicates your frame to start talking about deficits at the same time you're talking about fairness, and that he sort of alluded to the idea that you might use taxes to kind of make things work for everyone, but it was a much easier to be vague about it. I think he felt like he would get more bang for the buck and avoid falling into the Republicans' trap. What the Republicans want to talk about is deficits. What Obama wants to talk about is fairness, and he can talk about fairness when he gets down in the details with people. If people want to have a back and forth, he can relate his fairness message to deficits, but he doesn't have to do it directly. And I think that one could see that as almost like a lesson learned between last year's State of the Union, when he really tried to tie the two together distinctly, and this year's where it was much vaguer, and we can imagine how to connect the dots, but he certainly didn't make it explicit.
Yeah. Well, I agree with both of you, and let me just say there is a mountain of survey evidence suggesting that the American people don't believe that there's just a little bit wrong with our tax code. They think it's completely broken, like the government. And so they do want not just tweaking of the rates for individuals or corporations. There is a vast public desire for comprehensive tax reform that could achieve the dual objectives of fairness, both actual and perceived, and revenue. Right? There's no contradiction between the two. And I actually think that the president missed an opportunity to steal a march on the Republicans by wrapping his arms around the idea of tax reform as part of the fairness agenda. And I think he's left, he's left some political space there that they will probably try to occupy.
Well, except that a lot of his fairness agenda he put through the tax code.
Yeah, but it's but it's tweaky. It's not it's not systemic. It doesn't even begin to sidle up to PHS questions. Right. Yes, sir.
Maybe you can hear that. Hi. First of all, thank you for your comments. I'm John Schlazer. There was one sentence that was in the speech that was touched on a little bit here, but not really addressed, and that's that question about Social Security, where the president talked about the fact that, of course, we have to protect seniors, and I thought he opened that area up a little bit, and I wanted to see how you might interpret that in relationship to a politically, in terms of his speech and the follow-on. Thank you.
I didn't pick up on that like you did. I didn't see an opening there to, for example, raising the retirement age or anything that would fundamentally, change the existing system. Do you want to just fill me in?
I thought the implication was I may be wrong, that's the first time I thought that he had mentioned that he might look at that issue, provided we protect the seniors. I could be wrong. It's one line, and I do not have it in front of me.
Well, you're right. He did. He did say that, and it was in the context of a discussion of some returning to some sort of grand bargain.
Right. But it wasn't. It's not the first time he's mentioned it. That's for sure. It's been there. I mean, I think he was maybe the vaguest he's ever been about it last night, and that makes perfect sense going into an election when seniors actually show up and vote in large numbers. And so I don't think it's a year where we're going to see any kind of meaningful action, let alone meaningful rhetoric around Social Security reforms. You'd have to be, I think, a little bit nuts to try and open that can of worms. You may disagree. I mean, it's a huge issue in terms of budget politics, but when it runs into electoral politics, it seems to me you might as well punt and wait on it until you actually know whether you've got the job or not.
I think that's fair enough. I mean, I interpreted that one line, which caught my attention as well, sir, as indicating that he is willing to rejoin the grand bargain talks that were abandoned so tumultuously last summer if he's reelected president, and that but the terms of entry, on his part will be a willingness to discuss Social Security and Medicare, and the terms of entry on the Republican side will be the willingness to discuss revenues. And he is not, he's not going to allow himself as a second-term president to be backed into the same corner that he was backed into last August. No way. So I actually think that line had to be in the speech, because that was virtually the only thing he had to say about our fiscal problems. And I don't think he wanted to be accused of having totally ignored the elephant in the room. He got as close to ignoring it as he decently could.
Can I just quickly, I mean, I agree with Elizabeth that you don't want to say anything threatening about Social Security and Medicare in an election year. I mean, that would be crazy. But you do have to say something about how you're going to shore up these programs for the long haul. If you don't really say anything at all about that, maybe that was the implication of that one sentence, but if you don't speak to that at all, then you're kind of dodging the big question.
Well, here are his exact words, just for the record. We're going to have to end here. As I told the Speaker this summer, I am prepared to make more reforms that rein in the long-term costs of Medicare and Medicaid and strengthen Social Security, so long as those programs remain a guarantee of security for seniors. Now, that opens the door, but in no way walks into the room. And I think you're both right. That's as far as he's going to go this year. Details to come next year if there is a next year. And with that, let me thank our panelists and thank the audience for its patience.